Once upon a time, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright in every way. He feared God and he abhorred evil. This is how the book of Job begins. Most scholars agree that the text was written between the 7th and the 4th centuries BCE, but that the core storyline could be hundreds of years older. Yet this ancient text takes on one of the most persistent questions of all time. Why do bad things happen to good people? It might seem strange to include the book of Job in a great mythologies series. We tend to think of it as one of a collection of books in the Old Testament, also known as the Hebrew Bible. But I want to make the case that this story addresses many of the most basic questions of mythology. What is humanity's place in the universe? And what is the nature of the divine? And what meaning can I find in my own human experience? The book of Job sets up a situation in which the protagonist and the audience along with him are forced to ask, what's the nature of suffering? Why do good people suffer? What part do the gods play in suffering? And how do we humans make sense of suffering? I think Job has lasted for so many centuries precisely because it asks these fundamental questions and because it doesn't offer easy answers to these questions. Instead, it reflects the mindset of the ancient Near East, a worldview very foreign to modern Westerners. In addition, the book of Job is a great literary piece. The poet Alfred Lord Tennyson called it the greatest poem of ancient and modern times. The story begins with a very strange scene, one found nowhere else in the Bible. God is holding court in the heavens, and Satan wanders in. God, perhaps glad for a visitor, points down on the earth to the man Job, calling him blameless and upright. Now we hear that Job is blameless and upright over and over in the story, from the narrator and from God himself. It's a key point, critical to the moral of the story, so we'll come back to this later. When God points out Job's faithfulness, however, Satan's not impressed. He basically says, well, what did you expect? You've given him every blessing, a loving family, financial success, and good standing in his community. Of course he praises you. And then things get really interesting. Satan challenges God, saying, stretch out your hand now and touch everything Job has, and he'll curse you to your face. Satan basically dares God to take all of Job's blessings away and then see how Job reacts. These are strong words, and God takes the bait. He gives Satan the right to destroy everything Job has except Job himself. Now, before we go any further, we need to stop and consider what just happened here. For seemingly no reason at all, God has allowed Satan to mess with a man's life. We know that Job didn't do anything wrong. The author makes sure to state this in no uncertain terms. Job doesn't deserve to be mistreated. So why does God allow this? What kind of God does this? Over the centuries, many commentators have metaphorically wrung their hands, anxious that we not dwell too long on this problem. But I think the book of Job wants us to ask this very question, even dares us to ask, what kind of God is this? We don't get an answer yet in the story, but it's coming. After God accepts Satan's challenge, God allows Satan to take away everything that Job loves, saying only that Satan can't touch Job himself. And the scene shifts back to earth, and we watch as Job loses almost everything. The description of Job's loss is one of the most poignant moments in the Bible. One by one, Job's servants come to his home, announcing one tragedy after another. First, one tells him that enemies have taken his oxen and his asses and slain his servants. Then another tells him that his sheep and more of his servants have been consumed by a fire. And then another tells him that enemies have taken his camels and killed more servants. And finally, one tells him that a windstorm destroyed his eldest son's home, killing all of Job's children in the process. Each messenger ends his announcement with the eerie refrain, I alone am escaped to tell thee. Every reader is left wondering, how will Job react? And the narrator tells us, Job grieves in traditional Israelite fashion by tearing his garments and shaving his head. But then he worships and praises God. Job mourns for his children, but he refuses to criticize God. And instead he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. To underscore the significance of this, the narrator states plainly that Job does not complain to God in any way, not once. And I find this truly remarkable. If the story ended there, we'd have an interesting, but not really unusual hagiography of a man who stayed true to God despite difficult circumstances. But the story continues. An indefinite period of time passes, and then the author repeats a phrase from the first chapter. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord. Now, this phrasing, one day, is the biblical equivalent of once upon a time. And this is exactly the same phrasing that introduced the first conversation between God and Satan. We're taken back up to the heavenly court with Satan strolling in from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down in it. The earlier exchange between God and Satan is repeated, with God boasting about Job's loyalty. And again, the Lord engages Satan in conversation. And again, God points out Job, this time adding the phrase, you incited me against Job to destroy him for no reason. And this time, Satan goes in for the kill. He cries out, skin for skin. A man will give up everything he has to save his life. And Satan dares God to touch Job's bone and his flesh. Once again, God accepts the dare, and he gives Satan permission to afflict Job in any way he chooses. The only requirement is that Satan must spare Job's life. Satan doesn't hold back. He gives Job painful boils all over his body, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, and Job endures excruciating pain. But despite all of this, the narrator declares that Job does not sin with his lips. He refuses to curse God. And now we come to the major shift in the story. To signal this, the text shifts in form from simple narrative prose to an extended section of poetry, a section that goes on for almost 40 chapters. In the process of making this shift, we're introduced to three new characters, Job's best friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Most of the rest of the story is an extended conversation between them, but before we move into that conversation, I want to point out one small action that usually goes unnoticed. In chapter 2, Job's three friends show up. They come to comfort Job, and when they first lay eyes on him, they can't believe what they see. Their friend is devastated with grief, and they begin to grieve with Job, and then they do a remarkable thing. The text says, they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him. Most scholars explain that the 7 days of grieving parallel what Jews call sitting Shiva. Traditionally, Jews stay at home for 7 days and nights to grieve when a family member dies. What's more remarkable to me is the fact that these friends sit completely silent for those 7 days, simply sitting with their friend. They wait patiently for Job to be the first one to speak. Now take a moment and put yourself in their place. Could you stay silent that long? I couldn't. Job's friend's patience is a remarkable gesture of friendship. That period of silence, of waiting, launches us into the meat of the story. Finally, Job speaks, and the tone of the story changes completely. Job is angry. He can barely contain his outrage. He can't understand why he's been put through all of this suffering. Job starts by declaring, I wish I'd never been born. And for the next 35 chapters, he asks over and over again the age-old question, why me? Job's friends try to convince him that it must be because he sinned. That's the only possible reason God could be allowing these bad things to happen. Each friend, including a fourth figure, Elihu, who shows up later, comes up with explanations for Job's suffering. And for 35 chapters, Job rejects these explanations. Again and again, he declares that he has lived a righteous life. And we, of course, know that this is true. Both the narrator and God himself have said so. Finally, in chapter 38, God himself begins to speak. And in this moment, we begin to get the real response to Job's question, why me? But the response we get isn't really an answer to Job's question. Instead, God pummels Job with questions of his own. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Like salvos, God launches question after question of his own. Can you send forth lightning? Can you make the Leviathan obey your command? Have you an arm like God? And of course, the answer is obvious. Job is nothing compared with God, the creator of the universe, the Lord of heaven and earth. At one point, Job tries to respond, making a feeble attempt to halt the avalanche of divine questions crashing down on him. But God is having none of it. God keeps pushing and pushing Job until he's made his point 10 times over. God exists and acts and rules over the universe and throughout millennia. Job, on the other hand, is a mere mortal, and his questions have limited significance in the grand scheme of things. Finally, in chapter 42, we get some relief. God's thundering speech comes to an end, and Job responds meekly, thoroughly chastised and completely subdued. He acknowledges God's almighty power, and he confesses his own ignorance. But this ignorance is a different kind of not knowing than he had expressed previously, and this is important. Early on in the book, Job had complained that he didn't understand why God allowed these tragedies to happen to him. But at that point, Job was completely absorbed in his own experience. Job was the focus of the story. By chapter 42, however, the focus has shifted. Now, Job confesses his essential ignorance as a human being. He says, I have uttered what I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me. Job realizes that he was not only ignorant about experiences in his own life, he was ignorant about the very nature of his life as a creature of God. As a human being, Job comes to realize that he has an inherently finite ability to understand the workings of the universe, and Job is moved to humility. This is a tough pill to swallow, and for many people, this is a completely dissatisfying answer to the problem of suffering. Is it really adequate to tell someone that in the grand scheme of things, her own individual experience is relatively unimportant, and she will always be ignorant of the big picture? This is what the book of Job seems to be saying. But don't get completely discouraged. There's a lot more actually going on in the story. At this point, it might be helpful to consider the world that the book of Job came out of. Job originated in ancient Jewish culture. The written version found in the Bible dates to around the 6th century BCE, but the oral tradition, the core story behind the written text, is much older. In the 6th century BCE, the Jews living in what is today part of Israel clashed repeatedly with Babylonian forces to the east, and they suffered devastating military losses. At the climax of this conflict, their land was taken over by the Babylonians. The sacred city of Jerusalem was destroyed, including its temple, which had been built by King Solomon and was the single most important religious site for the nation. The Jewish people were either slaughtered or forced into exile in Babylon. The text of the book of Job that we have was probably written for this community, a community that felt deserted by God. They believed that God had promised them all the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River in a covenant made centuries earlier with the patriarch Abraham, but suddenly this promised land appeared to be gone. The initial audience for the book of Job was trying to figure out how to make sense of the destruction of the sacred temple and of their own exile, because it seemed as if God had reneged on his promises. The character of Job stands in for this community. He experiences the despair and the abandonment that many of these people felt at the time. The book as we have it today is the result of a process called redaction or editing that occurred over many decades, even centuries. If you look at the written text, you can actually see where this happened on the page itself. You'll notice that the beginning and the end are written in prose, but most of the middle section is poetry. Scholars think that the book's prologue and epilogue were added to a much older oral tradition in the 6th century BCE, sandwiching or framing the ancient poetic material. The older poem in the long middle section is basically a long conversation between Job, his friends, and God. And this is where the extended argument between Job and his friends occurs, lasting for 35 chapters. This is also where God blasts Job, cataloging the mighty things that God has done and putting Job in his place. At the moment that Job finally humbles himself and acknowledges God's power and might, the story returns to prose form. It's as if mere narrative can't contain the scope and the weight of Job's internal conflict and God's self-revelation. We need poetry for that. One other bit of context might be helpful. The figure of Satan in the book of Job is not the devil of the New Testament or the serpent who deceives Eve in the Garden of Eden. Over time, the Christian church combined all of these figures into one, but that's not what we have going on in the book of Job. Keeping this in mind is important when we think about the deal that God makes with Satan. God is not making a deal with the devil. Instead, think of Satan in this story as a public prosecutor. His job is to bring people's shortcomings to God's attention. In fact, the original Hebrew word that we commonly translate into the name Satan here is ha-satan, which literally means accuser or prosecutor. This isn't the devil with pitchfork and horns. Instead, Satan is an articulate, intellectually astute figure who roams God's divine court in complete comfort. In effect, Satan is just doing his job as the heavenly prosecutor, pointing out that Job is not altruistic. He actually has many practical reasons to be loyal to God. Nowhere else in the Bible do we see this character, this prosecutor, who eggs God into wagers about the mortals on earth. It's truly a unique dynamic. So now it's time to ask, why has the book of Job held such strong appeal for 25 centuries? I think the answer lies in Job's final words to God. In his last sentences, Job describes his direct encounter with God. He cries out, "Now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." The same Job who argued with his friends self-righteously about his innocence, who basically dared anyone to show where he had sinned, has done a complete 180. He's been humbled in his encounter with the divine. At the same time, while Job has had to endure God's challenges, he has also enjoyed a profound privilege. Job experienced God directly, face to face. According to the Bible, only a handful of people are granted this intimate contact with God, and they are always his favorites: Moses, Abraham, and David. These men, and they almost always all seem to be men, but that's a conversation for another time. These men, like Job, often don't get the answers they want from God. They see and experience deep suffering and disappointment. And like Job, they often never receive a direct or a satisfactory answer to their questions. Some scholars and religious leaders have tried to fudge this point, but I think it's pretty clear. The real message of the book of Job is that God often fails to answer the the direct questions put to him. Instead, God shifts the entire conversation. In effect, God's response to Job and to the reader is, "You're not asking the right question. Spend time with me and you'll see your situation in an entirely different light." Many people have found this so-called answer to the problem of innocent suffering completely unsatisfactory. And in fact, many scholars think that the epilogue to the book was added later as an attempt to end the story on a happy note. As I pointed out earlier, after Job humbles himself, the format of the book shifts back to prose again. God criticizes Job's friends for challenging Job's righteousness, and then he restores Job's fortunes, making Job twice as wealthy as he had been previously. God grants Job new sons and daughters, as well as a long life. It's as if the final editor couldn't bear to have the book end on a dismal note. So he added an uplifting wrap-up, suggesting indirectly that God is finally rewarding Job for his righteousness. You can practically hear the inspirational music swelling in the background. However, I think it's a mistake to interpret the blessings given at the end of the book as some kind of reward for Job's righteousness or for his extreme suffering. The book never challenges the idea that Job is righteous. In fact, God's final rebuke to Job's friends suggests that God considers Job a righteous man, as he had stated previously and repeatedly to Satan. And the book never suggests that suffering will eventually be rewarded. Instead, the book of Job suggests that righteousness is beside the point when it comes to suffering. Job's righteousness is no protection from suffering. In fact, the book of Job seems to teach explicitly that suffering should not be explained as punishment for sin. Suffering is not a punishment for doing wrong. It's just part of the human condition. The moral of the story, it turns out, really has nothing much to do with righteousness or suffering at all. God's response to Job's tirade is to pose his own question, which is basically, who do you think you are? Now, I don't mean this as a snide remark or a rhetorical question. We are really meant, I believe, to take God's question seriously, to ask ourselves, who am I really in the grand scheme of things? What right do I have to expect happiness and contentment in my life? And what am I truly capable of understanding about my place in the cosmos? The answers are humbling and even a little bit unnerving. The version we have of the book of Job was crafted by a community whose cultural, religious, and political heart had been attacked and razed to the ground. It felt like New York City after 9/11 to New Yorkers. In the wake of this disaster, these people who had lived centuries ago wrestled with the terrible things that had happened to them, and they searched for reasons. The question of why bad things happen to good people is a common concern across human cultures. Theology answers these questions with doctrines, but mythology answers these questions with stories, and these stories put a human face on the experience of suffering. For example, in a later lecture, we'll see that one Buddhist myth suggests that the way to deal with suffering is not to expect any compensation or restitution. Instead, the story teaches that we must shift our perspective to understand that everyone suffers. We're not alone. A measure of comfort comes from knowing we're not alone. In the story of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh's suffering is part and parcel of becoming human, in contrast to the tyrannical egomaniac he started out as in the beginning of the story. In Gilgamesh's world, the gods often directly cause human suffering, and they're certainly not too interested in explaining why or how to overcome it. Gilgamesh is left to make sense of the suffering he sees and experiences by himself. Mythologies centered on the questions of suffering continue to be relevant today. Many of us have had to try to make sense of personal tragedies, and we've all struggled to find meaning in public, communal tragedies, such as natural disasters, large-scale accidents, and acts of terrorism. Job goes right to the heart of the matter, asking if we should understand moments of human suffering as a punishment for bad behavior. And the book of Job's answer to this question is a resounding no. As we've seen, the book doesn't offer a clear alternative explanation. In fact, Job doesn't really offer closure of any kind. I like this about the book. Instead, the book makes a bold move, challenging the very act of asking questions. The book of Job shifts the foundation underneath us, pushing a thoughtful reader to shift her entire perspective on the question of suffering. It draws a line in the sand between two schools of thought. The first school, represented by Job's friends, wants an easy, straightforward explanation for suffering. And one easy answer is that suffering is punishment for human sin. And for centuries, this explanation has been accepted by lots of people. The second school, represented by Job's character, especially in his direct encounter with God, rejects this explanation. In this second approach, human suffering can't be explained by sin. In fact, suffering isn't even the focus of the conversation anymore. Instead, God is the focus. God metaphorically shakes Job up, stopping him from navel-gazing and making Job look directly into the eyes of the God of the universe. Now, if that isn't enough to shift your perspective, nothing is. The book of Job's response to the problem of suffering isn't for everyone. Over the years, I've taught the book of Job to hundreds of students, and they always become deeply unsettled as we work our way through the story. By the end, they are literally squirming in their seats. They can't wait to argue with me. But then I point out that we are having the very same arguments that Job and his friends had. And my students walk out of the classroom door really unhappy about that. But they also walk out the door thinking hard about the book of Job and about the complicated nature of humanity's role in the universe. And they never forget this book. Let me close with one final image. In 1969, humanity was given its first glimpse of Earth from the moon, a finite blue planet in a seemingly infinite sea of black. Details disappeared, and our understanding of the scale of human experience shifted. As science has advanced, we've been able to see our planet from much further distances, lost among other planets and stars in the vast Milky Way. Over the centuries, we've constantly had to relinquish the illusion of being at the center of things. Our country isn't at the center of a flat Earth. Our Earth isn't at the center of the galaxy. And our galaxy isn't even at the center of the universe. The book of Job offers a narrative equivalent of this galactic shift in perspective. The book forces us to look at the world from a different perspective and to frame our individual and communal experiences in a different way. And that is exactly what mythology does. It reframes our day-to-day existence, providing meaning where previously there was none. Job and other books like Job resituate the human experience, pulling back from a close-up shot focused on me, and zooming back for a panoramic shot of the entire cosmos from the divine point of view. With this cosmic perspective in mind, the book challenges us to rethink how we imagine our place in the world and the questions we ask in life. Now, this is uncomfortable, I know. Job gets under your skin each time you read it. But that, I believe, is precisely the reason that Job continues to command our attention, not just as a religious story, but as a timeless story about our human experience. Not because it answers our questions, but because it dares us to ask entirely new ones.